The night before my medical school interview, my sister poured a bottle of bleach all over my only professional blazer. When I showed my parents the ruined fabric, they rolled their eyes, told me to stop making a scene, and ordered me to wear it anyway. So I did exactly what they asked. I walked into the most prestigious medical institution in Atlanta wearing a destroyed jacket, but when the dean of admissions looked at the bleached lining of my coat, then down at my application file, all the color drained from his face. He stood up, his hands shaking, and whispered, "Wait, you are her. I am Zariah. 24 years old, and right now I am sitting in the living room of my penthouse, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. It is a long way up from the basement room my parents forced me into. They thought ruining my clothes would ruin my future, but they had no idea that their petty act of jealousy was about to unlock a $12 million secret they had kept hidden from me my entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your family try to sabotage your success only for it to backfire on them completely. I want you to picture the scene in that interview room. Dean Sterling was a man who intimidated everyone. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, adjusting his glasses as I walked in. I knew how I looked. The dark blue fabric of my blazer was violently scarred with jagged white chemical stains. It looked like an act of vandalism because it was. I sat in the leather chair opposite him, keeping my posture perfectly straight, refusing to show a single ounce of shame. My parents, Vivian and Marcus, along with my older sister Chloe, expected me to cancel the interview. They expected me to cry, to break down, and to stay home so I would not overshadow my brother-in-law Trevor, who was currently failing to secure funding for his fake medical device startup. But I refused to give them the satisfaction. Dr. Sterling looked at me with clear disdain at first. He asked me why I would show up to an interview for one of the most competitive medical programs in the country looking like I had crawled out of a dumpster. I maintained eye contact and told him it was the only blazer I owned, and I was not going to let an unfortunate laundry accident stand in the way of my medical career. He scoffed and leaned forward to examine the damage more closely. That was when his eyes caught something. When Chloe poured the bleach, the harsh chemicals ate through the outer navy layer and dissolved the inner lining. Exposed underneath that lining was a small embroidered crest, a family crest that had been sewn deep into the vintage jacket. I had found the blazer hidden away in a storage box at home years ago, assuming it was just old clothing. Dr. Sterling stared at the exposed embroidery, completely ignoring my resume. He asked me to take the jacket off. I hesitated, but he insisted. He traced his fingers over the intricate stitching of the crest. Then he scrambled to open my file, his eyes darting between the crest and my full legal name, Zariah Jefferson Ross. The air in the room shifted instantly. The condescension in his voice vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shock and reverence. He looked up at me, his professional mask entirely gone. He asked me if I knew who originally owned this blazer. I told him I did not. He slowly sat back down, taking a deep breath before revealing a truth that would destroy my parents' perfect little empire. He told me that blazer belonged to Dr. Isaiah Jefferson, a pioneer in cardiovascular surgery and one of the most prominent African-American medical inventors in history. And more importantly, he was my late grandfather. Dr. Sterling looked me dead in the eye and asked the question that changed my life. Why are you wearing ruined clothes to beg for a spot in a school that your family practically built when you are the sole heir to a $12 million medical trust? To understand how I ended up sitting in that prestigious office listening to a $12 million revelation, you have to look at what happened exactly 14 hours earlier. It was a humid Thursday evening at my parents' sprawling estate in Buckhead. I was in the laundry room carefully steaming the navy blazer I had bought from a thrift store. It was the only piece of professional clothing I owned that fit me perfectly. I was focused, nervous, and determined to ace my medical school interview. Then the door swung open. My older sister Chloe marched in holding a large plastic bottle of industrial bleach. She was wearing her designer silk pajamas, looking effortlessly flawless as always. Behind her stood her husband, Trevor. Trevor was the golden son-in-law, a white tech bro who had convinced my parents to back his supposedly revolutionary medical device startup. The problem was that his startup was built on smoke and mirrors, and it was failing miserably. Just that morning, the exact same medical institution I was interviewing for had formally rejected Trevor's pitch for a $2 million research grant. The board had seen right through his lack of actual medical expertise. His ego was profoundly bruised, and Chloe, being the devoted enabler she was, needed someone to punish, to make her husband feel powerful again. "You are really going to wear that cheap rag tomorrow," Chloe sneered, leaning against the washing machine. Trevor crossed his arms, glaring at me like my very existence was a personal insult to his pride. He muttered that it was humiliating enough that the medical board had laughed at his proposal, but now his sister-in-law was going to walk into their offices begging for a diversity scholarship. Before I could even defend my hard work, Chloe unscrewed the cap of the bleach bottle. She looked me right in the eye, gave a sickly sweet smile, and upended the entire bottle directly over my blazer. The harsh chemical smell burned my eyes instantly. The dark blue fabric hissed and turned a violent patchy orange as the liquid ate through the material. I stood completely frozen, staring at the ruined garment. "What is wrong with you?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with rage. Chloe just laughed and tossed the empty bottle onto the floor. She told me she was doing me a favor, that I needed to learn my place and stop trying to embarrass the family with my unrealistic ambitions. The loud commotion drew my parents downstairs. My mother Vivian walked in first, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, followed closely by my father Marcus. I pointed at the ruined blazer and told them exactly what Chloe had just done, maliciously and intentionally. I expected outrage. I expected them to finally discipline their golden child for crossing a massive line. Instead, my mother let out a heavy sigh, acting as if my ruined future was merely a slight inconvenience to her peaceful evening. "Zaria, please lower your voice," my mother demanded, waving her hand dismissively. "Trevor is under an immense amount of stress right now. His company just faced a major financial setback today, and you are being incredibly selfish by causing a scene in our home." My father stepped up beside Trevor, placing a supportive hand on his son-in-law's shoulder. He looked at me with pure disgust. "Your sister made a simple mistake while doing the laundry," my father lied effortlessly. "Put on something else tomorrow or cancel the interview entirely. We are not going to tolerate your dramatic outbursts tonight." I looked at the four of them standing together. My father, who cared more about validating a failed white entrepreneur than supporting his own flesh and blood. My mother, who viewed my potential success as a direct threat to her perfect family narrative. Chloe, who thrived on my misery. And Trevor, who smirked from behind them, enjoying the unearned power he held in a house he did not even build. They wanted me to break down. They wanted me to scream, to cry, and to ultimately submit to their control. I did not give them a single tear. I calmly reached into the sink and picked up the dripping chemical-soaked blazer. The fabric burned my bare hands, but I did not flinch. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and told her I would not be canceling anything. I walked past them, my posture rigid, leaving a trail of bleach drops on their expensive hardwood floors. I walked out the front door into the dark Atlanta night, holding the ruined jacket like a shield. I did not know yet about the $12 million or the stolen legacy waiting for me. I just knew I was going to use their sabotage to burn their entire empire to the ground. The morning of the interview, I did not try to hide the damage. I put on a crisp white button-down shirt and slipped the ruined blazer over my shoulders. The stark white chemical burns slashed across the dark navy fabric like violent streaks of lightning. The material was stiff and smelled faintly of chlorine, but I wore it like armor. I walked into the soaring glass atrium of the Atlanta Medical Institute with my head held high. The waiting room was filled with applicants who looked exactly like you would expect. They were children of wealthy doctors, dressed in flawless tailored suits, whispering to each other about their legacy admissions and summer vacations in Europe. When I walked in, the entire room went dead silent. A few candidates openly smirked. The receptionist actually picked up her phone, likely to call security, before I firmly stated my name and my appointment time. When the heavy oak doors of the boardroom finally opened for me, I stepped into a massive space designed to intimidate. 3 distinguished medical professionals sat behind a long, polished table. In the center was Dean Sterling, a man whose reputation for breaking applicants was legendary. To his left was Dr. Kensington, the chief of surgery, a woman known for her merciless standards. To his right sat Dr. Allister, the head of the research department. I walked across the room, the sound of my heels echoing off the marble floor. If there had been a camera capturing this moment, it would have been placed low on the ground, angling up at me to capture the sheer, unbreakable confidence radiating from my posture. Dr. Kensington did not even bother to look at my file. She dropped her pen onto the table with a sharp clatter and stared at my jacket. Her face contorted into a mask of pure disgust. She asked me if this was some sort of tasteless prank or if I simply lacked the fundamental respect required to enter the medical profession. Dr. Allister chimed in, adjusting his tie and stating that if an applicant could not be bothered to maintain basic professional hygiene, they had absolutely no business dealing with human lives. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to stammer out an apology, to cry about my family situation, or to beg for their mercy. Instead, I stood perfectly still. I did not apologize. I looked Dr. Kensington directly in the eyes and told her that my attire was the result of unforeseen circumstances, but my intellect was completely intact. I stated that I was here to be evaluated on my capacity to save lives, not my ability to purchase a new suit on short notice. I calmly pulled out the chair and sat down, crossing my legs, waiting for them to proceed. Dr. Kensington let out a harsh, condescending laugh. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She told me that if I was so incredibly confident in my intellect, they would skip the standard behavioral questions. There would be no asking about my greatest weaknesses or my volunteer work. She decided to throw me straight into a clinical trial by fire, determined to humiliate me and expose me as a fraud so they could throw me out of the building. She gave me a rapid-fire scenario. A 28-year-old trauma patient arrives in the emergency department with a penetrating chest wound. He is hypotensive, his neck veins are distended, and his heart sounds are muffled. His Glasgow coma scale is dropping rapidly. You are the only person in the trauma bay. Walk me through your exact physiological diagnosis and your immediate surgical intervention step by step. It was a classic presentation of Beck's triad indicating cardiac tamponade, but she wanted the surgical steps, something a pre-medical student was never expected to know. I did not even blink. I told her the patient was suffering from acute cardiac tamponade due to pericardial effusion compressing the heart chambers. I calmly explained that I would bypass a pericardiocentesis because of the penetrating trauma and proceed immediately to an emergency resuscitative thoracotomy. I detailed the exact placement of the scalpel for a left anterolateral incision in the 5th intercostal space. I described slicing through the subcutaneous tissue and the intercostal muscles, carefully avoiding the internal mammary artery. I explained how I would insert the rib spreader inside the pericardium, longitudinally to avoid the phrenic nerve, evacuate the blood clots to relieve the cardiac pressure, and then locate the myocardial laceration to control the bleeding with digital pressure or a temporary Foley catheter balloon before suturing. The room went completely silent. Dr. Kensington's condescending smile vanished. Dr. Allister looked at her, then back at me, his skepticism turning into defensive irritation. He immediately threw a second scenario at me, hoping to catch me off guard. He asked me to explain the exact pharmacokinetic mechanism of a rare adverse reaction to a specific class of anesthesia and how to reverse it on a genetic level. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on my lap, and dismantled his question with surgical precision. I detailed the mutation in the ryanodine receptor gene that causes malignant hyperthermia. I explained how the volatile anesthetic triggers a massive uncontrolled release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum inside the muscle cells, leading to a hypercatabolic state. I broke down the exact dosage and administration of dantrolene, explaining how it acts directly as a ryanodine receptor antagonist to halt the calcium release, and I seamlessly referenced a peer-reviewed clinical trial published just 2 months prior regarding new protocols for managing the subsequent metabolic acidosis. I did not just answer their questions. I dominated their entire boardroom. I used my medical knowledge like a weapon, slashing through their elitism and their snap judgments. I made it abundantly clear that while they were sitting in their comfortable mansions playing politics, I had spent the last 4 years studying with a desperate burning hunger to succeed. The dynamic in the room inverted completely. I was no longer the poor ragged applicant begging for a chance. I was an undeniable force of nature towering over their expectations. Dr. Kensington sat back in her chair, visibly stunned, unable to formulate another attack. Dr. Allister stared at my application file as if it had suddenly caught fire. He could not comprehend how someone outside of their privileged circle possessed this level of elite medical comprehension. They had tried to break me, using the very science they dedicated their lives to, and I had used it to completely silence them. Through this entire intense exchange, Dean Sterling had not said a single word. He had been sitting in the center of the panel, his hands steepled in front of him, watching me with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He was not looking at my face anymore. As the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom hit the chemical burns on my jacket, the dissolved navy fabric parted slightly, revealing the inner lining I had never paid attention to. Dean Sterling leaned forward slowly. His eyes were fixated on the small, intricate crest embroidered directly over my heart, a crest that had been hidden by the dark wool until Chloe poured bleach all over it. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. The contempt that had filled the air just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating heavy tension. The dean finally reached out and pulled my application file toward him, looking down at my last name, and the true power shift of the morning was about to begin. Dean Sterling did not speak immediately. The silence in the boardroom stretched out heavy and thick as he kept his eyes locked on my chest. I thought he was going to reprimand me for the bleach stains to finally deliver the rejection my parents and my sister Chloe had so desperately wanted. Instead, his hands began to tremble. He slowly removed his glasses, placing them carefully on the polished mahogany desk, and leaned forward until he was mere inches from his microphone. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a hoarse whisper. He asked me exactly where I had found the jacket I was wearing. I kept my posture rigid, refusing to let him see any confusion. I told him the truth. I explained that I had found it years ago in a dusty storage box in my parents' basement, packed away beneath old winter coats and discarded household items. I told him I wore it because it was the only piece of professional clothing I had, and because the quality of the wool was unmistakable, even if the origins were unknown to me. Dr. Kensington rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by the detour. She started to say that the origins of my thrifted wardrobe were irrelevant to my admission status, but Dean Sterling raised his hand and silenced her instantly. He did not even look in her direction. He stood up from his chair, a man who usually commanded rooms without moving a muscle, and slowly walked around the massive table to stand directly in front of me. He asked me to stand. I complied, meeting his gaze directly. He reached out his hand, hovering just millimeters away from the ruined fabric where the bleach had dissolved the navy wool. He was staring at the small emblem woven into the inner lining. It was a caduceus intertwined with the roots of a sprawling oak tree, stitched in a very specific faded gold thread. For my entire life, I had not even known it was there. The dark outer layer of the jacket had completely concealed it until Chloe decided to pour industrial chemicals over my shoulder. Dean Sterling looked up at me, his eyes searching my face with an intensity that made the room feel incredibly small. He asked me to state my full legal name for the record. I told him my name was Zariah Jefferson Ross. Dr. Allister sighed heavily from the table, muttering that my name was already on the file and they were wasting valuable clinical evaluation time. Dean Sterling snapped his head toward his colleagues, his voice suddenly booming with a fierce protective authority that echoed off the marble walls. He asked them if they were completely blind. He asked them if they had any idea who was sitting in front of them, being subjected to their arrogant interrogations. He pointed a shaking finger at the gold crest on my chest. He told Dr. Kensington and Dr. Allister that the emblem was not a generic brand logo. It was a custom family crest commissioned by the founders of the Vanguard Surgical Society, an elite historically black medical coalition that had broken the color barrier in Southern hospitals decades ago. He turned back to me, his voice softening into a tone of absolute reverence. He told me that this specific crest woven with that exact gold thread belonged to only one man, Dr. Isaiah Jefferson. The name hit me like a physical blow. Isaiah Jefferson was my grandfather on my mother's side. Growing up, my mother Vivian and my father Marcus had painted a very specific, very ugly picture of the man. They told me he was a bitter, difficult person who chased unrealistic dreams and ultimately left the family with nothing but unpaid debts and a tarnished reputation. Whenever I expressed an interest in science or medicine, as a child Vivian would quickly shut me down, warning me not to end up like the disgrace of the family. They made his name a taboo subject in our household, a cautionary tale used to keep me compliant and subservient to their own narratives. But as I stood in that boardroom, Dean Sterling began to dismantle 24 years of my parents' calculated lies. He told me that Dr. Isaiah Jefferson was not a failure. He was an absolute titan of cardiovascular surgery. He was a pioneer who faced down the darkest, most oppressive days of segregation in the medical field and carved out an empire through sheer, undeniable brilliance. Dean Sterling explained that my grandfather had invented a revolutionary cardiac bypass valve in the late 80s, a device that completely altered the survival rates of open-heart surgeries worldwide. I felt the blood roaring in my ears. My mind raced back to the dinner conversations at my parents' house, to the way Trevor, my white brother-in-law, would sit at the head of our table, bragging about his mediocre medical startup. I thought about how Vivian and Marcus would praise Trevor as the savior of the family, the brilliant innovator who was going to put our name on the map. They had worshipped a fraud, while systematically erasing the legacy of a genuine medical pioneer who shared my exact bloodline. Dr. Kensington and Dr. Allister were utterly speechless. The arrogance had entirely drained from their faces, replaced by a profound, terrified realization of how they had just treated medical royalty. Dr. Kensington tried to backpedal immediately. She stammered out an apology, suddenly praising my flawless answer regarding the cardiac tamponade procedure, claiming she knew I had exceptional lineage the moment I started speaking. I ignored her completely. My eyes remained locked on the dean. Dean Sterling looked at the jagged white bleach stains ruining the dark fabric. The anger in his eyes was palpable. He was not looking at a ruined piece of clothing anymore. He was looking at the desecration of a historical artifact, a piece of living history that belonged to a man he clearly viewed as a legend. He asked me, his voice dangerously quiet, who had done this to my grandfather's coat. I did not blink. I did not soften the truth. I told him my family did it. I told him my sister poured the bleach while my parents watched and ordered me to wear it as a punishment. The dean closed his eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the sheer malice of that act. When he opened them, the sorrow in his gaze shifted into a sharp, piercing clarity. He walked back to his desk and picked up my application file. He told me that my parents had committed a sin far greater than destroying a vintage blazer. He said they had committed a monumental theft against my identity. And as he flipped to the final page of my file, Dean Sterling prepared to reveal a truth that would explain exactly why my family was so desperate to keep me feeling small, poor, and utterly powerless. Dean Sterling closed my application file and folded his hands on the polished mahogany desk. The heavy silence in the boardroom was no longer filled with contempt, but with a suffocating weight of impending truth. He looked at me with an expression that bordered on deep, profound grief. He asked me if I had ever heard of the Jefferson Medical Trust. I shook my head, my voice completely steady as I told him I had never heard those words in my entire life. Dr. Kensington shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, her arrogant demeanor entirely shattered. Dr. Allister stared at the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The dean took a slow, measured breath. He told me that my grandfather, Dr. Isaiah Jefferson, was a brilliant man, but his genius extended far beyond the operating room. He was a man who understood human nature perfectly, especially the nature of his own daughter, my mother, Vivian. Dean Sterling explained that Isaiah knew Vivian was consumed by status, superficial wealth, and an insatiable greed that blinded her to anything of real value. Because of this, my grandfather explicitly wrote Vivian out of his primary will. He did not leave her a vast fortune. He did not leave her the rights to his life's work. Instead, he established an ironclad, irrevocable trust designed to bypass her completely. Dean Sterling looked me dead in the eyes and revealed the magnitude of what had been kept from me. He stated that the trust contained exactly $12 million in protected assets. But the cash was merely a fraction of the true legacy. The crown jewel of the trust was the absolute exclusive intellectual property rights to the Jefferson valve, the cardiovascular device my grandfather had patented decades ago. The trust mandated that upon my 18th birthday, the sole ownership of the $12 million and all associated medical patents were to be transferred directly and exclusively to me. My heart slammed against my ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing cold. For 24 years, my parents had force-fed me a completely different narrative. They had looked me in the face every single day and told me that my grandfather died a disgraced failure. They claimed he left them with crippling, insurmountable debts that they had to pay off. They used that lie to justify why I had to wear hand-me-down clothes, why I was not allowed to attend private school like Chloe, and why my mere existence was a massive financial burden on their household. They made me feel like a parasite draining their resources. As the dean's words echoed in my mind, a specific horrifying memory locked into place. I remembered the morning of my 18th birthday. There was no cake. There were no balloons. There was no celebration. Instead, Vivian and Marcus had called me into the kitchen before the sun was even up. They placed a massive stack of dense, complicated legal documents on the granite island. My mother had sighed heavily, rubbing her temples, and told me that because I was now an adult, I had to take legal responsibility for the financial strain I was causing the family. They told me the paperwork was a combination of liability waivers for my health insurance and co-signer agreements for community college loans. They said if I did not sign them, they would have no choice but to kick me out onto the street because they could no longer afford to feed me. I remembered crying at that kitchen table. I remembered feeling a crushing, suffocating guilt for simply being alive. My hands had shaken so badly that I could barely hold the pen, but I signed every single page they put in front of me. Sitting in the boardroom, the devastating reality washed over me. I had not been signing student loan agreements. I had been signing away my $12 million birthright. They had weaponized my guilt to trick a terrified teenager into transferring the administrative control of my grandfather's empire directly into their hands. They had stolen my identity, my legacy, and my future, all while demanding I thank them for keeping a roof over my head. The sadness and the betrayal I felt morphed instantly. The familiar heavy weight of being an unloved, unwanted daughter evaporated. It burned away, replaced by a cold, terrifying, and absolute clarity. The puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping together, forming a picture of pure, calculated fraud. My mind immediately went to Trevor, my arrogant white brother-in-law who constantly belittled me. Trevor was currently pitching a supposedly revolutionary cardiovascular surgical tool to investors across Atlanta. He claimed it was a proprietary design he had developed himself. It all made perfect sense now. Trevor was not a genius inventor. He was a thief. My parents had stolen my grandfather's patent, and they were attempting to launder it through Trevor's fake tech startup. They were using a white face and a Silicon Valley pitch deck to repackage stolen black excellence, hoping to sell my grandfather's life work to a massive medical conglomerate for a fortune that they could not legally claim themselves. They were funding Chloe's luxury cars and their own country club memberships with blood money that belonged entirely to me. Dr. Kensington cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence. She offered a trembling, pathetic apology. She told me the admissions board would be honored to grant me immediate entry into the medical program fully funded. She was desperately trying to backtrack, terrified of the sheer power I now represented. I looked at her, my face completely devoid of emotion. I did not thank her. I turned my attention back to Dean Sterling. I told him that I appreciated the offer, but I would have to defer my enrollment for the upcoming semester. I stated that I had a highly complex surgical procedure to perform first, and it required my undivided attention. It involved excising a massive malignant tumor from my own family tree. Dean Sterling did not ask me to explain. He saw the cold, calculated fire in my eyes and understood exactly what was about to happen. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. He slid it across the mahogany table toward me. He told me the man on that card was the most ruthless, brilliant trust and estate litigator in the state of Georgia. He told me this lawyer did not just win cases, he dismantled empires and salted the earth where they stood. I picked up the card and slipped it into the pocket of my bleached, ruined blazer. The jacket that was supposed to be my ultimate humiliation had just become the key to my absolute liberation. I stood up from the chair, towering over the 3 medical professionals who had tried to break me just 20 minutes earlier. I thanked the dean for his time and walked out of the boardroom. I did not walk out as the pathetic, unwanted scapegoat of the Jefferson Ross family. I walked out as the sole owner of a $12 million empire, and I was going to use every single cent of it to destroy the people who had stolen my life. I did not go back to my parents' house that night. I could not bear to look at them, to pretend I was still the broken, compliant daughter they expected. I checked into a hotel downtown, using the last of my savings, and I called the number on the business card Dean Sterling had given me. The man who answered the phone was Jonathan Vance, a litigator who specialized in trust and estate fraud. He agreed to meet with me the very next morning. I walked into his office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, still wearing the bleached blazer. I told him everything. I told him about the lie my parents had constructed regarding my grandfather's debt, the paperwork they forced me to sign on my 18th birthday, and the $12 million trust Dean Sterling had revealed. Mr. Vance did not waste time with sympathy. He operated with a cold, terrifying efficiency that immediately put me at ease. He told me that if my parents had indeed hijacked an irrevocable trust using coerced signatures, we were not just looking at a civil dispute. We were looking at massive systemic financial fraud. He required authorization to launch a full forensic audit into the Jefferson Medical Trust, and I signed the necessary paperwork immediately this time, knowing exactly what I was agreeing to. For the next 3 weeks, I lived a double life. To my family, I was still the obedient scapegoat. I returned to my parents' house, apologizing for my dramatic exit on the night of the interview, claiming the stress had gotten to me. Vivian and Marcus accepted my apology with their usual condescension, reminding me that I needed to learn to control my emotions if I ever wanted to amount to anything. Chloe smirked, assuming she had successfully crushed my spirit. Trevor, my arrogant white brother-in-law, barely acknowledged my return, too focused on preparing for a massive investor gala for his medical device startup. They had no idea that while they were busy playing their roles, Mr. Vance was systematically dismantling their financial facade. The preliminary findings from the forensic audit were staggering. Mr. Vance called me into his office and presented the data. My parents had not just taken control of the trust, they had been treating it like a personal slush fund for the past 6 years. He showed me the bank transfers. The down payment for Chloe and Trevor's lavish new home in the affluent suburbs had been wired directly from one of the trust's subsidiary accounts. The expensive country club memberships, Vivian's designer wardrobe, Marcus's sudden influx of capital for his own failing business ventures. It was all funded by the $12 million my grandfather had intended for me. They had created a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts to siphon the money, assuming I would never be smart enough or brave enough to challenge them. But the stolen cash was not even the most damning revelation. Mr. Vance slid a thick folder across the desk. It contained the intellectual property filings for Trevor's startup Vanguard Innovations. I opened the folder and felt a sickening jolt of realization. The flagship product Trevor was pitching to investors, the supposedly revolutionary cardiovascular tool that was going to make him a billionaire, was an almost exact replica of the Jefferson valve. Trevor had not invented anything. My parents had handed him my grandfather's patented designs. They had deliberately obscured the origins, tweaking minor, inconsequential details to bypass immediate patent infringement flags, but the core technology, the genius of the device, belonged entirely to Dr. Isaiah Jefferson, and legally, it belonged entirely to me. Mr. Vance explained the magnitude of their crime. They were not just stealing money, they were attempting to sell stolen intellectual property to a major medical conglomerate. If Trevor successfully secured the $50 million buyout he was currently negotiating, the funds would be laundered through his startup, effectively washing the stolen asset and leaving me with absolutely nothing. The anger I felt was no longer hot and chaotic. It was ice-cold, precise, and surgical. I asked Mr. Vance what our next move was. He told me that we had enough evidence to file a massive lawsuit, but a protracted legal battle would give them time to hide assets and spin a narrative. He suggested we needed a checkmate, a public undeniable exposure that would freeze their assets instantly and destroy Trevor's fraudulent company before the buyout could be finalized. I looked at the intellectual property filings. I realized that to orchestrate a perfect collapse, I needed access to Trevor's internal corporate data. I needed the final unredacted contracts he was preparing for the buyout. I needed to know exactly who he was selling my grandfather's legacy to, and I needed to intercept it from the inside. I told Mr. Vance I was going to get him the final piece of the puzzle. I was going to infiltrate Vanguard Innovations. I pulled my beat-up sedan past the wrought iron gates of my parents' Buckhead estate and immediately saw that the driveway was lined with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were frantically rushing to park a parade of Mercedes, Porsches, and Teslas. I parked my own car far down the street out of sight and walked up the long, manicured pathway. Music drifted through the open French doors, accompanied by the distinct rhythmic clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the loud, arrogant laughter of Atlanta's elite. My parents were not just throwing a dinner party, they were hosting a high-stakes investor gala for Vanguard Innovations. I stepped through the heavy front doors and was immediately hit by the sheer scale of their hypocrisy. The foyer was adorned with massive floral arrangements that easily cost thousands of dollars. Waitstaff in black vests glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of caviar and truffle hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the entryway watching the people who had stolen my future use my money to fund their opulent lifestyle. Every silk drape, every expensive bottle of wine, every flashing diamond in this room had been paid for by the genius of Dr. Isaiah Jefferson. My mother Vivian spotted me almost instantly. She broke away from a group of wealthy socialites, her face tightening into a mask of pure irritation as she marched toward me. She was wearing a stunning emerald green gown and a diamond necklace that caught the light with every step. I looked at that necklace and calculated exactly how much of my trust fund she had siphoned to wrap those stones around her neck. Vivian grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin, and pulled me into the shadow of the hallway. She hissed at me, demanding to know where I had been and why I was showing up in the middle of Trevor's crucial fundraising event. She told me that tonight was the most important night of Chloe's life and warned me not to do anything to embarrass the family. I kept my face entirely blank. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back up to her eyes and softly apologized. I played the role she expected perfectly. I told her I was just tired from working temporary jobs and promised I would stay out of the way. Satisfied that she had subdued me, Vivian released my arm, smoothed down her gown, and told me to grab a tray from the caterers if I insisted on standing around. I did not grab a tray. I moved silently through the crowd, blending into the background, watching my family perform their grand illusion. My father Marcus was holding court near the grand staircase, swirling a glass of bourbon. He was boasting to a group of venture capitalists about his brilliant son-in-law, claiming that Trevor was the next great visionary in cardiovascular technology. Chloe stood nearby, dripping in expensive jewelry, nodding along and playing the role of the devoted wealthy wife. She looked incredibly smug, completely convinced of her own superiority. Then the music faded, and my father tapped his glass with a silver spoon. He called the room to attention, his voice booming with artificial warmth. He welcomed the investors, thanking them for coming to witness the dawn of a new era in medical technology. With a sweeping gesture, he introduced the CEO of Vanguard Innovations, Trevor. Trevor stepped onto the landing of the staircase, a charismatic, perfectly practiced smile on his face. He was wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my entire college tuition. A massive flat-screen monitor had been set up behind him in the living room, displaying the sleek, modern logo of his fake startup. Trevor began his pitch. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a mediocre white man who had been handed the keys to a kingdom he did not build. He talked about the crisis in open-heart surgery, the complications of valve replacement, and the desperate need for a safer, more efficient surgical tool. He used all the right buzzwords, captivating the room with promises of massive profit margins and global market dominance. Then, he clicked a button on his remote, and a highly detailed rotating 3D rendering of a medical device appeared on the screen behind him. My blood turned to absolute ice. Trevor proudly announced that this was the Vanguard core valve, a proprietary mechanism he claimed to have spent the last 5 years developing in secret. He described its unique expanding mesh framework and its specialized deployment catheter. He detailed the exact anatomical benefits of the design, claiming it would reduce surgical mortality rates by 20%. The investors in the room murmured in awe, completely sold on the illusion. I stood in the back of the room, my hands clenched so tightly into fists that my fingernails dug into my palms. I was not looking at the Vanguard core valve. I was looking at a stolen blueprint. I recognized every curve, every specific mechanical hinge, every brilliant engineering choice. It was the exact device Dean Sterling had described to me. It was the Jefferson valve. The audacity of the theft was breathtaking. Trevor had not invented a single component of that machine. He had taken my grandfather's lifework, slapped a slick new corporate logo on it, and was currently using it to solicit $50 million from private equity firms. He was standing in my parents' house, drinking champagne bought with my money, trying to auction off my legacy to the highest bidder. Trevor concluded his presentation to a round of enthusiastic applause. Investors immediately swarmed him, eager to write checks and secure their stake in the company. I watched Chloe walk up to him and plant a celebratory kiss on his cheek. They looked like the perfect, unstoppable power couple. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully buried my grandfather's name and completely erased me from the equation. I knew right then that I could not just sue them. A quiet legal settlement would never be enough. I needed to let Trevor climb to the very top of his fraudulent pedestal. I needed him to sign the contracts to gather the media to believe he had secured the $50 million buyout. And then I was going to cut the foundation right out from under him and let him fall. I waited for the initial rush of investors to clear before I made my move. I walked directly up to Trevor and Chloe. When Chloe saw me, her triumphant smile twisted into a sneer. She asked me if I enjoyed the presentation loudly, wondering if I even understood half the medical terms Trevor had used. Trevor chuckled, swirling his drink, looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity. He told me it was a shame I had dropped out of college, noting that if I had applied myself, maybe I could have worked as a receptionist at his new corporate headquarters. I swallowed every ounce of my pride. I looked down at the floor, forcing my shoulders to slump, playing the part of the defeated, desperate sister. I told Trevor that his presentation was incredible. I let my voice waver slightly, telling him that I was struggling to pay my rent and that I was drowning in bills since my parents had cut me off. I looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes, and I begged him for a job. I told him I did not care what the position was. I told him I would fetch coffee, file paperwork, or clean the office. I begged him to let me be his unpaid intern just so I could put something respectable on my resume. Chloe burst out laughing. She looked at Trevor, clearly delighted by my public humiliation. She told him he should hire me just so I could finally learn what real hard work looked like. Trevor looked me up and down, his ego swelling to massive proportions. The idea of having his brilliant failed sister-in-law scrubbing his floors and bringing him coffee was simply too tempting for him to pass up. It fueled his superiority complex perfectly. Trevor gave me a condescending smile, patted me aggressively on the shoulder, and told me to report to the Vanguard Innovations office on Monday morning at 6 a.m. sharp. He told me not to be late, or he would fire me on my first day. I thanked him profusely, bowing my head and acting as if he had just saved my life. I turned and walked away from them, keeping my head down until I was safely out the front door and walking down the dark, quiet street toward my car. When I finally reached my vehicle, the pathetic, subservient mask dropped instantly. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and let out a cold, sharp laugh. Trevor thought he had just hired a desperate maid to stroke his ego. He had no idea he had just handed the rightful owner of his entire company the keys to the front door. I had my way in. I was going to infiltrate Vanguard Innovations, rip their stolen data straight from their servers, and prepare the trap that would send them all to prison. Monday morning hit Atlanta with a humid, suffocating heat, but my mind was completely ice cold. I arrived at the Vanguard Innovations headquarters at exactly 5:45. The building was a towering structure of glass and steel, located right in the heart of Midtown. As I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the massive corporate logo bolted to the exterior, my stomach turned. Every single pane of glass, every polished steel beam, and every expensive leather chair inside that building was bought and paid for by the genius of Dr. Isaiah Jefferson. I badged in with the temporary pass the night security guard handed me and stepped onto the top floor. The executive suite was an obscene display of stolen wealth. There were imported Italian espresso machines, modern abstract art pieces hanging on the walls, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. I found a small cleaning closet near the break room, grabbed a rag, and waited for the king of thieves to arrive. Trevor did not show up at 6 in the morning. He strolled through the double glass doors just after 9:30, holding a green smoothie and loudly barking orders into his headset. When he saw me standing near the reception desk, he actually stopped and laughed out loud. He told the person on the phone he would call them back because his new personal maid had arrived early. I forced my shoulders to round forward and kept my eyes glued to the floor. I followed him into his massive corner office, which was decorated with framed articles praising him as a medical visionary. Before he could hand me a list of degrading chores, I pulled a crumpled piece of paper from my pocket and placed it gently on his mahogany desk. I told him it had arrived in the mail on Saturday. It was a formal rejection letter from the Atlanta Medical Institute. I had spent 2 hours on Sunday forging it on heavy cardstock, perfectly replicating the Dean of Admission's signature. I made sure the letter was ruthlessly worded, stating that my clinical knowledge was severely lacking and my professional presentation was entirely unacceptable. Trevor picked up the letter and read it silently. A slow, deeply satisfied grin spread across his face. He leaned back in his expensive ergonomic chair, thoroughly enjoying the physical proof of my supposed failure. I kept my voice low and unsteady, playing the role of a completely shattered woman. I asked him if we could make my unpaid internship official. I told him I desperately needed the Vanguard Innovations name on my resume if I ever hoped to get a low-level administrative job at a local clinic. I begged him to let me stay, promising I would do absolutely anything he required without asking for a single dime. Trevor looked at me like I was an insect he had just crushed under his expensive loafers. He pulled a standard non-disclosure agreement and an unpaid intern contract from his drawer, sliding them toward me with a smug look. He told me that my primary responsibilities would involve scrubbing the employee restrooms, fetching his personal dry cleaning, and organizing the supply closets. He made it very clear that I was not to speak to the actual engineers or the executive staff because my presence was an embarrassment to his corporate brand. I signed the paperwork immediately, offering him a pathetic whisper of gratitude. The daily humiliation began right then and there. Trevor made it his personal mission to degrade me in front of as many people as possible. When he hosted morning briefings with his top developers, he would intentionally spill his coffee on the boardroom table just so he could summon me to wipe it up while they watched. He would loudly critique my cheap retail clothing, telling his staff that charity was a burden, but he felt obligated to help his wife's destitute sister. I scrubbed baseboards until my knuckles bled. I emptied trash cans filled with discarded blueprints that contained my grandfather's stolen mechanics. I fetched lunch orders for men who were actively conspiring to sell my birthright. And through every single degrading task, I smiled. I kept my head down, I said yes, sir, and I became completely invisible to them. That invisibility was my greatest weapon. Because they viewed me as a worthless, uneducated dropout, they did not bother to hide anything from me. When I was on my hands and knees, wiping down the glass walls of the server room, I was actually memorizing the security layout and the keypad access codes. When I was organizing the files in Trevor's private office, I was noting the exact physical location of his secure hard drives and reading the confidential legal memos regarding the $50 million buyout. They treated me like a piece of furniture, completely unaware that I was a Trojan horse, gathering enough highly classified data to send every single one of them to federal prison. By Wednesday afternoon, the psychological warfare escalated. I was in the main bullpen, carrying a heavy tray of iced coffees for the engineering team when the elevator doors chimed. Chloe stepped out into the office carrying several massive designer shopping bags. She was wearing a stunning white linen suit, looking like she had just stepped off a runway. She spotted me immediately. The entire office seemed to pause as the CEO's glamorous wife walked directly toward the unpaid intern carrying the drinks. Chloe stopped right in front of me, blocking my path. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of pure malice. She loudly announced to the entire room that she was surprised I was not wearing my signature navy blazer to work today. Several engineers snickered in their cubicles. Chloe stepped closer, her voice dripping with venom. She told me it was a real tragedy what happened to that cheap little jacket the night before my interview. She asked me if the medical board had thrown me out the moment they smelled the bleach, or if they had actually bothered to read my pathetic application before rejecting me. The rage inside my chest flared so hot it felt like a physical burn. I wanted to drop the heavy tray of coffees right onto her pristine white shoes. I wanted to grab her by the throat and tell her that her entire life of luxury was funded by the genius of the black grandfather she constantly mocked. I wanted to scream that I was the rightful owner of this entire building and that she was nothing but a parasite wearing stolen diamonds. But I did not react. I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I swallowed the burning pride in my throat, and I gave my sister a soft, broken smile. I looked her in the eyes and thanked her. I told her that ruining my jacket was exactly the reality check I needed. I said I finally realized I was never smart enough to be a doctor, and I was just incredibly grateful that she and Trevor were kind enough to let me clean their floors. Chloe's eyes widened slightly, genuinely surprised by my total submission. Then she threw her head back and laughed. It was a loud, sharp sound that echoed across the bullpen. Trevor stepped out of his office, joining his wife, wrapping his arm around her waist, as they both looked down at me. Trevor told the engineering team to take notes, stating that Vanguard Innovations was a place where failed dreams came to die and real visionaries thrived. Chloe patted me condescendingly on the cheek, telling me to be careful not to spill the coffees, because the carpet was expensive. They walked away together, heading into Trevor's private office to celebrate their superiority. I stood in the middle of the room holding the tray, letting the entire staff look at me with pity. I turned and walked toward the break room to distribute the drinks. As soon as I was out of sight, my submissive smile vanished entirely. My hands were perfectly steady. They thought they had broken me. They thought bringing up the bleached blazer was the ultimate victory. They had no idea that while Trevor was busy showing off for his wife, he had left his primary workstation completely unlocked and unattended. I set the tray down on the counter. I pulled a small encrypted flash drive from the pocket of my cheap trousers. I had exactly 3 minutes while they were distracted in the executive suite. I slipped into the adjacent server room, bypassed the first security gate using the code I had memorized on Tuesday, and plugged the drive directly into the main terminal. I was not just entering the lion's den anymore. I was locking the doors from the inside, and I was about to burn the entire cage to the ground. The data extraction took exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds. I watched the progress bar on the secure terminal hit 100%. pulled the flash drive from the port, and slipped it deep into the pocket of my trousers. I grabbed my cleaning tray and stepped out of the server room just as Trevor and Chloe emerged from the executive suite entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just captured every single encrypted file, financial ledger, and stolen patent blueprint they possessed. The rest of the week became a masterclass in psychological endurance. Having my foot inside Vanguard Innovations was only the first step. To maintain my cover and ensure they did not change their security protocols before I could detonate my legal trap, I had to completely submit to their daily torment. Trevor escalated his behavior with a sickening sense of entitlement. He made it his personal mission to degrade me in front of his entire staff, using me as a prop to inflate his own fragile ego. He would order catered lunches from high-end Atlanta restaurants for the entire engineering department and deliberately exclude me from the head count. When the staff finished eating, he would instruct his administrative assistant to scrape the expensive leftovers directly into the trash rather than let the unpaid intern eat. I watched him throw away untouched sushi and prime steak while maintaining a flat, grateful smile. He wanted me to starve. He wanted me to break down and beg for a scrap of his charity. I did neither. I simply picked up my spray bottle and went back to scrubbing the glass walls of his conference room. He forced me to crawl under the desks of his junior developers to untangle thick knots of computer wires while they were actively coding. The engineers, mostly arrogant young men who worshipped Trevor's toxic corporate culture, would intentionally stretch their legs, kicking their expensive shoes into my shoulders and pretending it was an accident. Trevor would stand at the end of the aisle swirling his coffee loudly, announcing that manual labor builds character for those who lack the intellectual capacity for higher education. I kept my eyes focused on the dust trapped in the carpet fibers. I focused on the cables in my hands. I absolutely refused to let them see the fire raging behind my eyes. Thursday morning brought a different, far more agonizing kind of torture. The silver elevator doors chimed and opened to the executive floor, revealing my parents. Vivian stepped out wearing a tailored pastel Chanel suit, her hair perfectly blown out, carrying a massive ribbon-tied box of artisanal pastries from an exclusive bakery in Buckhead. Marcus walked beside her in a bespoke navy suit, projecting the image of a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. They were not here to check on my well-being. They were here to survey their stolen kingdom. Trevor rushed out of his corner office to greet them, playing the role of the devoted, brilliant son-in-law to absolute perfection. He hugged Vivian enthusiastically and shook Marcus by the hand loudly, welcoming them to the Vanguard Innovations headquarters. The entire office stopped working to watch this display of affluent family unity. I was currently stationed near the heavy commercial copy machine organizing a stack of useless marketing brochures. I kept my head bowed, but I could feel Vivian's sharp eyes scanning the bullpen until they locked directly onto me. Trevor intentionally called out my name, projecting his voice so every single employee on the floor could hear him. He snapped his fingers sharply, gesturing for me to approach the reception area. I put down the brochures, smoothed out my cheap wrinkled slacks, and walked toward them. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze fixed on the floorboards, playing the role of the disgraced broken daughter with absolute precision. Vivian looked me up and down, an expression of profound pity mixed with intense, undeniable satisfaction washing over her features. She handed the heavy box of expensive pastries to Trevor's assistant with a grand, sweeping gesture. She loudly announced that she brought treats for the brilliant minds working at Vanguard, thanking the staff for their tireless dedication to her son-in-law's incredible vision. She did not offer me a single crumb. Instead, she looked at the dust marking the knees of my pants and let out a long, theatrical sigh. She told me that it was truly a blessing from God that Trevor possessed such a generous heart. She stated that any other CEO would have called building security the moment a pathetic college dropout wandered into their lobby begging for a handout. Marcus chimed in, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. He told Trevor that the entire family owed him a massive debt of gratitude. He claimed that he and Vivian had tried absolutely everything to instill a sense of ambition and pride in me. But some people are just genetically destined for the bottom of the corporate ladder. He said it was a profound relief to see me finally doing something useful with my life, even if it was just emptying other people's trash cans. Trevor ate up their praise like a starving animal. He puffed out his chest, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on Marcus's shoulder. He told my father that it was his moral duty to provide charity to the less fortunate. He looked right at me and smirked, telling my parents that he actually found my presence highly motivating for his real staff. He claimed that whenever his engineers felt tired or overwhelmed by their complex workloads, they just looked at me scrubbing the baseboards and realized how incredibly lucky they were to have a formal education. Several people in the bullpen laughed out loud. My own mother joined in a sharp, crystalline laugh that echoed off the glass walls. She reached out and patted my cheek, her manicured nails pressing sharply against my skin. She told me to work hard and listened to Trevor, noting that if I showed enough blind dedication, maybe one day he would trust me enough to operate the coffee machine unsupervised. The urge to shatter her illusion right then and there was almost intoxicating. The $12 million trust fund was sitting in a secure account under my legal control. The stolen patent blueprints were currently locked on the encrypted flash drive, burning a hole in my pocket. I had the power to destroy their entire reality with a single sentence. I could look my father in the eye and tell him I knew exactly whose money funded his country club membership. I could tell my mother that her Chanel suit was bought with the blood and genius of the black father she despised, but I bit my tongue until I tasted copper. I gave Vivian a weak, subservient nod. I thanked her for her advice. I looked at Marcus and thanked him for raising me with such strong family values. I turned to Trevor and loudly, so the entire office could hear, expressed my profound gratitude for his limitless charity. I told them I would not let them down. Marcus looked visibly repulsed by my submission. He turned his back on me completely and asked Trevor about the preparations for the upcoming investor gala on Saturday night. Trevor immediately pivoted back into his arrogant business mode, leading my parents toward his glass-enclosed office to show them the new 3D printed prototype of the cardiovascular valve. Trevor snapped his fingers at me one last time, ordering me to bring a tray of fresh coffees into the office for his VIP guests. I went to the break room, prepared the tray, and carried it into the lion's den. I set the coffees down on the mahogany desk, just as Trevor was handing the prototype to Marcus. My father held the intricate mesh device up to the light, marveling at the engineering. He praised Trevor for his sheer genius, claiming the design was flawless. Trevor smiled modestly, claiming the structural geometry had come to him during a late-night brainstorming session. I looked directly at the physical manifestation of my grandfather's stolen legacy. I recognized the specific strut design my grandfather had meticulously drawn in his private journals decades ago. The sickening reality of their shared psychotic delusion hung heavy in the room. They had told this lie so many times they actually believed it themselves. Trevor casually dismissed me, pointing toward the door and telling me to go clean the restrooms before the afternoon meetings. I did not hesitate. I turned and walked away from my parents. As I knelt on the cold tile floor of the employee restroom, listening to the muffled sounds of my family celebrating their impending wealth just down the hall, a cold, genuine smile spread across my face. Let them laugh. Let them wear their stolen diamonds and bask in their fake glory. They were planning a massive celebration for Saturday night, completely unaware that I was currently finalizing the guest list for their funeral. Friday morning arrived with a frantic electric energy coursing through the Vanguard Innovations headquarters. The $50 million investor gala was exactly 36 hours away, and Trevor was driving his staff into the ground. He paced the bullpen like a dictator, barking orders at exhausted engineers and demanding that every single piece of marketing material be absolutely flawless. I pushed my gray plastic cleaning cart down the center aisle, keeping my head bowed as developers rushed past me. I was practically invisible, just another piece of the office machinery completely ignored by the men who were about to become incredibly wealthy off my stolen legacy. Trevor snapped his fingers at me from the doorway of the executive suite. He ordered me to prepare 3 pots of artisanal pour-over coffee and deliver them to the main conference room. He was calling a mandatory all-hands meeting to run through his final pitch presentation. He looked at my worn cleaning uniform and sneered, telling me that once the coffee was delivered, I was to remain in the break room and polish the catered silverware until my fingers cramped. He made it explicitly clear that he did not want my depressing presence ruining the victorious atmosphere of his meeting. I gave him a weak, obedient nod and scurried toward the kitchen. As soon as the heavy glass doors of the conference room clicked shut behind the last engineer, the subservient posture vanished from my body. I set the silver polishing cloth down on the granite counter. Through the frosted glass of the break room, I could see the silhouette of Trevor standing at the head of the conference table, his arms waving grandly as he began his speech. I had exactly 45 minutes. I slipped out the back door of the kitchen and moved silently down the executive hallway. My target was not the main server room this time. The preliminary data I had extracted earlier in the week gave me the network architecture, but the finalized legally binding buyout contracts and the unredacted financial ledgers were kept on an isolated air-gapped terminal inside Trevor's private office. He was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew the paper trail of his fraud was a massive liability, so he kept the most damning evidence physically separated from the company network. I unlocked his office door using the master keycard I had cloned 2 days prior from the distracted head of security. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, instantly enveloped in the quiet luxury of Trevor's stolen empire. His desk was massive, carved from solid mahogany, but my focus was entirely on the sleek black terminal sitting in the corner of the room. If a camera were following me right now, it would be a tight, continuous tracking shot, moving in perfect synchronization with my hands. The lens would glide smoothly alongside my fingers as they danced across the mechanical keyboard. I did not hesitate. I bypassed the standard login screen, using a backdoor exploit I had coded myself late last night. The terminal screen flickered from black to a stark, blinding white as I gained root access. The tracking shot would push in closer, capturing the rapid reflection of scrolling text in my eyes. I navigated through his hidden directories, my heart pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. I found the financial folder first. I opened the master ledger, and the sheer scale of their embezzlement stared back at me. I was looking at a meticulously detailed roadmap of my own stolen $12 million. There were dozens of shell companies with generic names registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I traced the wire transfers line by line. I saw the exact dates Vivian and Marcus had authorized massive withdrawals from my grandfather's trust, funneling the money directly into Vanguard's operating accounts under the guise of anonymous angel investments. They had essentially funded Trevor's fake company with my inheritance, creating a perfect loop of fraudulent capital. I hit the execution command, and the progress bar appeared on the screen, rapidly copying the ledgers to my encrypted drive. The camera would pan slightly following my right hand as I clicked into the next folder. This one was labeled Intellectual Property Transfer. I opened the primary document, and the breath caught in my throat. It was a formal deed of assignment officially transferring the exclusive patent rights of the cardiovascular valve from Dr. Isaiah Jefferson directly to Trevor's holding company. I scrolled to the bottom of the document and felt a sickening wave of pure rage. There on the signature line was my grandfather's name. It was a flawless forgery backdated to a month before his death. They had literally stolen the ink from a dead man's pen. Next to it was the signature of a corrupt notary public, someone my parents had clearly paid off to legitimize the fraudulent transfer. Seeing my grandfather's name desecrated on that document was the final catalyst. Any lingering microscopic shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously harbored was completely incinerated. They had not just robbed me. They had dishonored a brilliant black pioneer who had fought through decades of systemic racism to build a legacy only for it to be hijacked by a mediocre white man who wanted to play tech billionaire. I initiated the download for the forged intellectual property documents, my fingers flying across the keys with lethal precision. The tracking shot would capture the final critical moments as I located the buyout agreement. It was a massive 50-page contract drafted by a top-tier corporate law firm. A major international health conglomerate was officially offering $50 million to acquire Vanguard Innovations, fully contingent on Trevor holding the undisputed rights to the valve technology. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the climax of the gala tomorrow night. Trevor was planning to put his pen to paper in front of the local press, sealing his victory and washing the stolen money forever. The download progress bar hit 98%, 99, 100. The transfer complete notification flashed in green text. I safely ejected the flash drive and pulled it from the terminal. The heavy metal of the casing felt warm in my palm. It was no longer just a digital storage device. It was a loaded weapon packed with enough radioactive evidence to secure federal indictments for every single person who had participated in this conspiracy. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a heavy door opening echoed down the hallway outside. The all-hands meeting was breaking early. I heard the muffled, arrogant laughter of Trevor approaching his office, flanked by his senior engineers. I moved with absolute terrifying efficiency. I wiped the terminal history, restored the login screen, and wiped down the keyboard with the sleeve of my shirt. I sprinted silently across the plush carpet, slipping out the secondary side door that connected to the executive assistant's vestibule, just as Trevor's hand turned the brass knob of the main entrance. I quietly pulled my cleaning cart from the alcove and immediately dropped to my knees, grabbing a microfiber cloth and furiously polishing the chrome base of a hallway planter. The heavy mahogany door swung open. Trevor stepped out, still laughing at a joke one of his developers had made. He literally stepped over my legs, not even bothering to look down. He told his assistant to make sure my pathetic self was out of the building before the catering team arrived to set up for Saturday. I kept my head bowed, my hand moving in steady rhythmic circles over the chrome. I whispered a soft, obedient confirmation. I waited until his office door clicked shut again. Then I slowly sat back on my heels. I reached into the pocket of my uniform, my fingers wrapping tightly around the flash drive. The infiltration was complete. I had the financial records, I had the forged patents, I had the buyout contracts. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was set, and my family was sprinting blindly toward the edge of the cliff. I sent a single one-word text message to Jonathan Vance, secured. The execution phase was officially authorized. I drove my battered sedan back to my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate, my heart hammering a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. The encrypted flash drive was safely hidden inside a slit I had cut into the lining of my cheap trousers. When I pulled into the driveway, the property was already swarming with activity. Event planners, lighting technicians, and high-end caterers were rushing across the manicured lawns, setting up massive white tents and crystal fixtures for the $50 million gala tomorrow night. My parents were preparing to celebrate the greatest heist of their lives. I walked through the side service entrance, keeping my head down, planning to slip quietly into my basement bedroom. But before my hand could even touch the doorknob, I heard the sharp, unmistakable clicking of Vivian's designer heels striking the marble floor behind me. She grabbed my shoulder, her grip painfully tight, and spun me around. She did not offer a greeting. She simply ordered me to get upstairs to my father's private study immediately. She said Marcus was waiting for me, and that I was not to speak to any of the event staff on my way up. The air in the house suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I knew instantly that the dynamic had shifted. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor and followed her up the grand staircase. Marcus was sitting behind his massive oak desk, the room smelling strongly of expensive bourbon and leather. The moment I crossed the threshold, Vivian stepped inside behind me and firmly locked the heavy double doors. The loud click of the deadbolt echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. I stood in the center of the plush Persian rug waiting for them to make their move. Marcus did not yell. He did not slam his fists on the desk. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that was infinitely more dangerous than rage. He told me that the security logs at Vanguard Innovations showed my keycard accessing the executive hallway during the exact time frame of Trevor's all-hands meeting. He said Trevor noticed I was lingering near his private office instead of polishing the silverware in the break room as instructed. My mind raced, but my face remained a perfect mask of confusion and fear. I knew they could not have seen the data transfer. The air-gapped terminal was completely off the grid, but they were paranoid. They were hours away from securing a $50 million buyout, and their greed was making them incredibly suspicious of any loose ends. And I was the biggest loose end in their entire fraudulent empire. Vivian stepped forward, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She told me to drop the innocent act. She said they did not care if I was trying to steal office supplies or if I was just being a lazy, incompetent maid. She stated that my erratic behavior was becoming a massive liability to the family's reputation, and they were no longer going to tolerate my unpredictable presence. Marcus opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the polished wood, pushing them toward the edge of the desk. He told me it was a comprehensive durable power of attorney and a complete psychiatric proxy. I looked down at the documents, feeling a chilling wave of realization wash over me. I knew exactly what those papers were. They were not just asking for control. They were demanding absolute total conservatorship over my entire existence. If I signed those documents, I would be legally declaring myself mentally unfit. I would be granting Vivian and Marcus the undisputed legal right to manage my healthcare control, my movements, and most importantly, commandeer any and all financial assets tied to my name. It was their final desperate fail-safe. They wanted to legally bind me so that if I ever discovered the $12 million trust fund, I would have zero legal standing to claim it. They would already own me on paper. I looked up at Marcus, letting my eyes widen in manufactured panic. I asked him why I would ever sign something like that. I let my voice tremble, playing the role of the terrified, cornered animal they believed me to be. Vivian laughed, a harsh, grating sound that lacked any trace of maternal warmth. She walked over to me, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive perfume clinging to her skin. She told me I did not have a choice. She explained that I already had a documented history of extreme emotional instability from the night I dropped out of college. She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and laid out their extortion plan with terrifying precision. She told me that Marcus had 3 highly respected, deeply corrupt psychiatrists on his country club payroll. If I refused to sign the documents right now, Marcus would make a single phone call. Those doctors would arrive at the estate within the hour, sign an emergency involuntary psychiatric hold, and have me dragged out of the house in restraints. She promised me that I would be locked inside a high-security behavioral health facility by midnight. She looked me dead in the eyes and asked me who a judge would believe. 2 prominent, wealthy Atlanta philanthropists trying to save their severely troubled daughter, or a ragged, hysterical college dropout having a psychotic break. It was pure, unadulterated blackmail. They were threatening to strip away my basic human rights and lock me in a psychiatric ward just to protect their stolen fortune. They expected me to fight back. They expected me to scream, to call them monsters, to throw a tantrum that they could use as immediate proof of my supposed insanity. But I was always one step ahead of them. Before I even walked into the study, the moment Vivian grabbed my arm in the hallway, I had slipped my hand into my pocket and pressed record on my phone's voice memo app. The microphone was currently capturing every single threat, every extortionate demand, and every piece of illegal coercion echoing through the room. I knew exactly what I had to do to close the trap. I forced tears to well up in my eyes. I let my breathing turn shallow and ragged. I dropped to my knees right there on the Persian rug, clutching the edge of Marcus's desk. I sobbed, begging them not to lock me away. I told them I was sorry for being a failure. I promised I would never embarrass them again. I played the broken, defeated daughter with an Oscar-worthy performance. Vivian looked down at me with absolute disgust. She nudged my shoulder with the pointed toe of her designer heel, telling me to stop crying and pick up the pen. I reached up with trembling hands and grabbed the heavy gold fountain pen Marcus was holding out to me. I let a single genuine tear fall onto the thick parchment paper to really sell the absolute devastation of the moment. I flipped to the back page and signed my name on the dotted line. I signed away my medical rights, my financial autonomy, and my freedom. Marcus snatched the documents off the desk the second my pen lifted from the page. He inspected the signature, a deep, victorious smirk spreading across his face. He looked at Vivian and nodded. The loose end was officially tied up. He turned back to me, his voice dripping with condescension. He told me to get out of his office, go straight down to the basement, and lock myself in my room. He explicitly forbade me from showing my face during the gala tomorrow night, stating that security would physically remove me if I stepped foot on the main floor. I nodded weakly, keeping my head bowed in total submission. I stood up, wiped my face, and shuffled toward the heavy oak doors. Vivian unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, not even bothering to look at me as I walked out. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me. The moment I was alone in the hallway, the tears stopped instantly. My posture snapped perfectly straight. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit stop on the recording. I looked at the audio file, a pristine 30-minute documentation of felony extortion, blackmail, and medical fraud. I tapped the screen and uploaded the file directly to Jonathan Vance's secure cloud server. Vivian and Marcus thought they had just secured their stolen empire. They thought they had chained me to the floor. They had absolutely no idea that I had just handed the FBI everything they needed to put my parents in federal prison for the rest of their lives. I smiled, walking down the grand staircase toward the basement. Tomorrow night was the gala. Tomorrow night the world was going to watch them burn. The moment I locked the door to my basement bedroom, I walked over to the small, rickety desk in the corner and emptied my pockets. I placed my phone on the wooden surface, the audio file of my parents' extortion, already safely uploaded to Jonathan Vance's encrypted servers. Then I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the heavy gold fountain pen Marcus had forced me to use. I stared at the polished metal casing and let out a quiet, genuine laugh. My parents were so blinded by their own arrogance and their desperation to secure the $50 million buyout that they missed the most crucial detail of our entire interaction. They saw a broken, hysterical daughter crying on the floor. They saw me desperately clutching the edge of the mahogany desk, hyperventilating as I signed my rights away. What they did not see was the sleight of hand I had practiced for hours with Mr. Vance. When I had thrown myself onto the floor in a fit of manufactured panic, my hand had intentionally knocked the thick stack of legal documents slightly askew. In that split second of chaos, while Vivian was looking down at me in disgust, and Marcus was anticipating his victory, I slid a single sheet of heavy watermarked parchment paper directly under the final signature page. Mr. Vance had anticipated this exact maneuver. He knew that wealthy, cornered narcissists always resort to psychiatric proxies or conservatorships to neutralize a whistleblower. He had prepared a counter-document, a highly specific legal rider known as a revocation and admission of fiduciary breach. But the genius of the trap did not end with the hidden paper. The gold fountain pen I had pulled from my pocket was not Marcus's pen. I had swapped his standard Mont Blanc for an identical model I had purchased 2 days prior. My pen was loaded with a specialized slow-fading polymer ink. Within 48 hours, my signature on their precious power of attorney would completely oxidize and vanish, rendering their extortion document entirely void and legally useless. However, the pressure from my frantic, heavy-handed signature had transferred perfectly through the top sheet and onto the carbon copywriter I had hidden underneath. In his desperate rush to execute the trap and lock me in the basement, Marcus had snatched the stack of papers and aggressively signed the bottom line to formally authorize his acceptance of the proxy. He did not bother to read the fine print of the page I had slipped in. By signing that specific document, Marcus legally waived his right to contest any federal audit of the Jefferson Medical Trust. More importantly, he legally accepted full, unlimited personal liability for any corporate malfeasance tied to Vanguard Innovations. He thought he was signing the paperwork to lock me in a psychiatric ward. In reality, he had just signed a legally binding confession that stripped away his corporate immunity and served him on a silver platter to the federal government. At 2 a.m, long after the caterers had left the estate and the house had fallen dead silent, I slipped out of my basement window. I moved like a ghost across the manicured lawns, bypassing the security cameras I had memorized during my cleaning shifts. I walked 3 miles down the dark, humid Atlanta roads until I reached a 24-hour diner on the edge of Midtown. Jonathan Vance was sitting in a corner booth drinking black coffee waiting for me. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him and placed the flash drive containing the Vanguard Innovations server data onto the table. I told him the data extraction was successful and that Marcus had executed the poisoned legal document exactly as we had planned. Mr. Vance did not smile. He operated with the cold mechanical precision of a sniper. He plugged the drive into his heavily encrypted laptop and spent the next 20 minutes verifying the stolen patent blueprints, the falsified financial ledgers, and the unredacted buyout contracts. When he finally looked up, the intensity in his eyes was absolute. He told me the evidence was flawless. He explained that he had already forwarded the audio recording of the extortion attempt to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The audio alone was enough to secure warrants for wire fraud, blackmail, and attempted medical kidnapping. But the contents of the flash drive escalated the situation into a massive multi-agency federal takedown. The Securities and Exchange Commission was now involved, specifically targeting Trevor for attempting to defraud a major health conglomerate with stolen intellectual property. Mr. Vance outlined the execution strategy for Saturday night. The $50 million buyout was scheduled to be signed in front of a crowd of elite investors, local politicians, and medical industry reporters at exactly 9 o'clock. Mr. Vance had coordinated directly with federal marshals. The moment Trevor put his pen to the fraudulent contract, the trap would snap shut. I thanked Mr. Vance, paid for the coffee, and walked back out into the dark. The fear that had dictated my entire life was completely gone. I was walking back to the estate, not as a victim, but as the architect of their destruction. Saturday morning broke with the chaotic, deafening noise of the gala preparations. The sprawling lawns of my parents' estate were transformed into an opulent wonderland. Massive white pavilions were erected, draped in expensive silk and illuminated by hundreds of crystal chandeliers. Delivery trucks constantly rolled up the driveway, unloading towering floral arrangements and crates of vintage champagne. I stayed locked in my basement room exactly as Marcus had ordered. Through the high, narrow window near the ceiling of my room, I could hear the arrogant voices of my family floating down from the terrace. Chloe was loudly complaining to an event planner that the imported white roses were not blooming wide enough. Trevor was laughing with Marcus, bragging about how the executives from the acquiring health conglomerate were already treating him like the next Steve Jobs of the medical world. Vivian was barking orders at the catering staff, ensuring every detail projected the image of untouchable generational wealth. They were absolutely drunk on their own hubris, completely convinced that they had outsmarted the world and successfully buried me in the dirt. As the afternoon bled into the evening, the noise outside shifted from preparation to celebration. The string quartet began to play, and the steady hum of affluent conversation filtered through the floorboards above me. I listened as the elite society of Atlanta arrived to worship at the altar of Vanguard Innovations. I did not put on a maid uniform. I did not put on cheap retail clothing. I unzipped the protective garment bag I had hidden in the back of my closet. Inside was the blazer. It was no longer the ruined, bleached jacket my sister had destroyed. Mr. Vance had connected me with a master tailor who specialized in vintage restoration. The artisan had painstakingly removed the chemically burned outer layer, meticulously preserving the inner lining and the brilliant gold crest of Dr. Isaiah Jefferson. The jacket had been reconstructed with midnight black bespoke wool, tailored to fit me with absolute razor-sharp perfection. The gold caduceus and oak tree crest now sat proudly on the outside, gleaming against the dark fabric over my heart. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and looked at myself in the cracked mirror of my basement room. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the unwanted scapegoat. I was the bloodline. I was the heir. I checked my watch. It was 8:45. The signing ceremony was 15 minutes away. I unlocked my bedroom door and began the slow, quiet walk up the basement stairs. The grand stage was set, the audience was waiting, and it was finally time to reclaim my empire. I moved silently through the dimly lit service corridors of the estate, guided by the muffled sound of a string quartet, playing a classical arrangement of a popular rhythm and blues anthem. I reached the heavy velvet drapes that separated the catering kitchen from the main outdoor terrace, and slipped behind them. From my hidden vantage point, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the entire $50 million spectacle. It was a sickening display of stolen opulence. My parents had transformed the sprawling lawns of our Buckhead property into a fortress of elite extravagance. A massive open-air pavilion crafted from sheer white silk billowed gently in the humid night air. Dozens of cascading crystal chandeliers had been suspended from the thick branches of the ancient oak trees, casting a brilliant diamond-like glow over the manicured grass. The crowd was a carefully curated collection of Atlanta's most powerful and influential African-American elite. There were prominent state senators, legendary civil rights attorneys, megachurch pastors, and ruthless venture capitalists, all gathered to witness what they believed was a historic triumph of Black generational wealth. I spotted my mother holding court near a towering champagne pyramid. Vivian was wearing a custom floor-length gown made of crushed silver velvet. A massive sapphire and diamond necklace hung heavily against her collarbone. She was laughing theatrically, pressing her manicured hand to her chest as she spoke to a group of influential real estate moguls. I watched her lips move, catching fragments of her conversation as she shamelessly boasted about the heavy burden of managing a family empire and the sacrifices she had made to foster such incredible medical innovation. Marcus stood just a few feet away, projecting the image of a wise, untouchable patriarch. He was smoking an imported Cuban cigar surrounded by a tight circle of private equity investors. He spoke with deep manufactured authority, claiming that Vanguard Innovations was built on the strict, uncompromising morals he had instilled in his family for decades. They were selling a masterclass in deception, soaking up the admiration of their affluent peers, while actively burying the true heir to their stolen kingdom in a basement room just a few yards away. And then there was Chloe. She was floating through the crowd like a conquering queen wearing a breathtaking scarlet haute couture gown that swept across the fresh grass. She was holding up her left hand to show off a flawless 5-carat emerald-cut diamond ring to a group of admiring society wives. She loudly proclaimed that Trevor had surprised her with the ring that very morning to celebrate their massive corporate buyout. She gushed about how incredibly brilliant her husband was, telling everyone that his mind simply operated on a higher intellectual frequency than the rest of the world. She played the role of the devoted, affluent muse, entirely oblivious to the fact that her shiny new diamond was paid for by the intellectual property of a Black grandfather she openly despised. Trevor himself was standing near the center stage, completely intoxicated by his own hubris. He was surrounded by the senior executive board of Apex Health Systems, the massive international conglomerate that was about to write him a check for $50 million. Trevor held a snifter of scotch, speaking to these highly educated, powerful Black executives with a subtle, sickening undercurrent of white savior complex. He was smiling warmly, but his posture reeked of unearned superiority. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone in the room. He believed he had taken the raw, unrefined medical concepts of a dead Black physician and elevated them into a corporate masterpiece that only a man of his specific pedigree could achieve. He was a parasite basking in the glow of a stolen sun. As the grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed 8:55, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The ambient chatter of the elite crowd died down to a low anticipatory murmur as the event planners directed the guests toward the main stage at the edge of the terrace. A heavy antique mahogany desk was carried onto the raised platform, followed by 2 plush leather chairs. The catering staff quickly distributed flutes of vintage champagne to every single guest. The local press corps, invited specifically by Marcus to document his family's historic triumph, positioned their cameras at the foot of the stage, their flashbulbs already popping in the humid night air. The CEO of Apex Health Systems, An imposing, impeccably dressed man stepped up to the microphone. He tapped the microphone twice and thanked the illustrious crowd for attending this monumental occasion. He spoke eloquently about the desperate need for groundbreaking advancements in cardiovascular surgery, and he praised Vanguard Innovations for developing a mechanism that would undoubtedly save millions of lives across the globe. He then turned his attention to the front row, where Vivian, Marcus, and Chloe were standing shoulder to shoulder, practically vibrating with greed. The CEO thanked the family for their incredible vision and their unwavering support of medical innovation. Finally, he extended his arm toward the side of the stage and introduced the man of the hour, calling Trevor a true pioneer of modern medical engineering. The crowd erupted into deafening applause. Trevor walked onto the stage, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit, waving to the audience with practiced false humility. He shook the CEO's hand, posing perfectly for the flashing cameras. He stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and prominent politicians. He spoke about the long, grueling nights of research, the tireless dedication to his craft, and the heavy responsibility of carrying such a brilliant life-saving vision into reality. He looked down at Chloe and told the crowd that he never could have built this empire without the unwavering love and foundational support of his incredible family. Vivian actually raised a hand to wipe a fake tear from her eye. Marcus nodded solemnly, his chest puffed out in absolute pride. They were savoring every single second of their fraudulent victory. An executive assistant in a tailored suit walked onto the stage carrying a thick leather-bound folio. He placed it carefully on the mahogany desk and opened it, revealing the final legally binding $50 million buyout contract. He placed a heavy gold fountain pen, the exact same model Marcus had tried to use to steal my freedom just hours earlier, next to the document. The crowd fell into a hushed, reverent silence. Trevor smiled, gave one last triumphant wave to the cameras, and sat down in the leather chair. He picked up the gold pen, hovering the nib just inches above the signature line. The trap was fully set. The entire world was watching. I let the heavy velvet drapes fall closed behind me. I stepped out of the shadows of the service corridor and walked directly into the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured, and terrifying cadence of a queen coming to reclaim her throne. The midnight black wool of my reconstructed blazer absorbed the light, but the brilliant gold caduceus and oak tree crest embroidered over my heart gleamed like a beacon. The countdown was officially over. I stepped onto the pristine grass of the main terrace, leaving the shadows of the catering kitchen far behind me. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, it would be a slow, majestic orbiting shot circling me in a continuous 360-degree sweep as I walked directly into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. The lens would capture the stark contrast between the sea of colorful, expensive evening gowns and the midnight black bespoke wool of my jacket. It would focus on the brilliant gold thread of the caduceus and the sprawling oak tree embroidered directly over my heart. The emblem caught the light of the flashbulbs glowing with the undeniable heavy weight of true generational legacy. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. I did not rush. I did not run. I walked with the absolute terrifying certainty of an apex predator stepping into a cage full of trapped prey. The elite African American Society of Atlanta, the state senators, the ruthless venture capitalists, the megachurch pastors, parted for me like the Red Sea. They did not know exactly who I was, but they instinctively recognized the raw, unfiltered authority radiating from every single step I took. The ambient chatter of the gala began to die down, rippling outward from where I walked until a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the massive silk pavilion. You could hear the clinking of ice in crystal glasses coming to a complete halt. You could hear the sudden sharp intakes of breath as the crowd sensed a monumental shift in the atmosphere. My mother was the first to see me. Vivian was standing near the towering champagne pyramid, frozen in the middle of a boastful sentence. The orbiting camera would capture the exact second her meticulously crafted facade completely disintegrated. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking ashen and hollow beneath her expensive makeup. Her hand, clutching a crystal flute of vintage champagne, began to shake so violently that drops of the golden liquid spilled onto her silver velvet gown. She recognized the blazer instantly. She recognized the gold crest of the father she had despised and the legacy she had tried to bury. She realized that the broken, subservient daughter she thought she had locked in a basement room was currently walking through her $50 million celebration looking like absolute royalty. Marcus noticed the sudden, terrifying shift in his wife's posture. He turned his head following her terrified gaze, and his eyes locked onto me. The thick Cuban cigar slipped from his fingers, tumbling silently onto the manicured grass. The untouchable patriarch of the family suddenly looked incredibly small. His broad shoulders slumped, and a look of profound, unadulterated panic flashed across his features. He saw the bespoke tailoring of the suit. He saw the unwavering, lethal calm in my eyes. He realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that I had not been defeated in his study. I had been playing him. The phantom of Dr. Isaiah Jefferson was marching directly toward his fraudulent stage, and Marcus possessed absolutely no power to stop it. He tried to take a step forward, perhaps to intercept me before I reached the platform, but his legs seemed glued to the turf. He was paralyzed by his own guilt. Chloe was standing at the foot of the platform showing off her 5-carat diamond ring when the suffocating silence of the crowd finally forced her to turn around. The smug, triumphant smile vanished from her face, as if it had been violently slapped off. She stared at the reconstructed blazer, her mind struggling to comprehend how the cheap, bleached rag she had destroyed with industrial chemicals had been resurrected into a masterpiece of high fashion. Her scarlet haute couture gown suddenly looked garish and cheap next to the sleek architectural perfection of my midnight wool armor. She took a stumbling step backward, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The golden child was entirely eclipsed by the true heir. She looked at her parents for help, but they were just as incapacitated as she was. Up on the raised mahogany stage, Trevor remained completely oblivious for just a few seconds longer. He was seated in the plush leather chair, basking in the flashbulbs of the local press corps. He had the heavy gold pen gripped tightly in his hand, the nib hovering a fraction of an inch above the signature line of the $50 million buyout contract. He was so intoxicated by his own unearned victory that he did not notice the dead silence that had swallowed the pavilion. He did not notice that the CEO of Apex Health Systems, standing just a few feet away, had stopped smiling and was staring intently at the woman approaching the platform. I reached the base of the wooden steps leading up to the stage. I did not break my stride. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished mahogany stairs echoed through the silent tent like the ticking of a bomb. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. The CEO of Apex Health took a slow, cautious step back, instinctively giving me the floor. He looked at the gold crest on my blazer, his eyes narrowing as recognition sparked in his mind. He was a highly educated executive in the medical industry. He knew exactly what the Vanguard Surgical Society was, and he knew that the crest I wore was not a generic corporate emblem. It was a seal of historical significance. He sensed the massive impending collision of realities, and he wisely moved out of the blast radius, crossing his arms over his chest to watch the execution unfold. Trevor finally looked up from the contract. The arrogant, self-satisfied grin was still plastered across his face, but it rapidly melted into an expression of sheer, uncomprehending confusion. He looked at my face, then down at my clothes, unable to reconcile the image of the pathetic, subservient maid who scrubbed his office floors with the majestic, commanding woman currently towering over him. He blinked rapidly, his white savior complex short-circuiting in real time. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to demand that security remove the unpaid intern from his stage, but no words came out. He was completely suffocated by the sheer atmospheric pressure of my presence. I stepped right up to the edge of the antique desk. I stood directly between Trevor and the flashing cameras of the Atlanta press corps. I looked down at him, my eyes cold, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. I did not yell. I did not cause a hysterical scene. I simply stood there, an immovable mountain of truth, casting a long, dark shadow over his fraudulent empire. The pen was still shaking in his hand, hovering uselessly over the thick, textured paper. The $50 million deal was literally sitting on the desk between us, but the distance might as well have been 1,000,000 miles. He was never going to touch that money. I was the bloodline. I was the heir. And I had arrived to collect exactly what was mine. I reached out with a steady, unyielding hand and clamped my fingers firmly around Trevor's wrist. The physical contact broke his paralysis. He gasped, dropping the heavy gold fountain pen onto the mahogany desk. It clattered loudly against the polished wood, rolling away from the signature line of the $50 million contract. I did not look at the pen. I reached past his trembling frame and grabbed the microphone from the stand. The feedback from the sound system shrieked for a fraction of a second before I stabilized it. The entire Silk Pavilion was dead silent. I looked out at the sea of Atlanta's elite. I introduced myself not as the estranged daughter, not as the unpaid intern, but as Zariah Jefferson Ross, the sole legal heir to the Jefferson Medical Trust and the exclusive owner of the cardiovascular technology sitting on the screen behind me. Trevor jumped up from his leather chair, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. He shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking with panic, demanding that security remove me from the stage. He yelled that I was a deranged, bitter college dropout trying to ruin his historic moment. He looked at the press corps, forcing a frantic, terrified laugh, claiming that I was experiencing a severe mental health crisis and had escaped from a psychiatric hold. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents sealed with the unmistakable blue ribbon of a federal court injunction. I held the paperwork high in the air, letting the flashing cameras of the press corps capture every single page. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice echoing off the canvas walls with absolute chilling authority. I announced that Vanguard Innovations was not a groundbreaking medical startup. It was a criminal enterprise built entirely on stolen intellectual property. I stated that the Federal Court of the Northern District of Georgia had just executed a blanket asset freeze on every single account associated with Trevor, Marcus, and Vivian. The $50 million acquisition could not proceed because the Vanguard core valve did not belong to Trevor. It was a direct stolen replica of the Jefferson valve invented by my late grandfather, Dr. Isaiah Jefferson. The crowd erupted. The refined, affluent silence was instantly shattered by a shockwave of gasps, panicked murmurs, and the relentless, blinding flashes of camera lenses. State senators whispered furiously to their aides. Venture capitalists who had just written massive checks to Trevor began pulling out their phones, frantically calling their legal teams to halt the wire transfers. Trevor slammed his hands onto the mahogany desk, leaning aggressively toward me. He grabbed the edge of the microphone stand and yelled that I was lying. He desperately claimed that he possessed a fully executed notarized deed of assignment, proving my grandfather legally transferred the patent rights to his holding company. He looked at the CEO of Apex Health Systems, his eyes wide with sheer desperation, begging the executive not to listen to my insane accusations. He swore on his life that the paperwork was completely bulletproof. I turned to face my brother-in-law, my expression completely devoid of sympathy. I informed him and the entire audience that the signature on his supposedly ironclad deed of assignment was a complete forgery. I explained that the transfer was dated a month before my grandfather's passing, during a period when Dr. Jefferson was in a medically induced coma and legally incapable of signing away his life's work. I told Trevor that federal investigators had already confiscated the original digital document from his air-gapped terminal. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face as I revealed that I was the one who had infiltrated his secure server. The unpaid intern he had publicly humiliated, the woman he had forced to crawl under desks and fetch his coffee, was the architect of his federal indictment. Trevor stumbled backward, his knees hitting the leather chair. He looked frantically toward the front row, searching for Marcus and Vivian to save him. I followed his gaze and locked eyes with my parents. Vivian was gripping the back of a velvet chair, her knees buckling as the reality of her total destruction set in. Marcus was frantically dialing his phone, likely trying to reach his high-priced defense attorneys, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped the device onto the grass. I spoke directly to them through the microphone, ensuring every investor, every politician, and every reporter heard the truth. I declared that my parents had orchestrated this massive theft to fund their opulent lifestyle, using my stolen inheritance to buy country club memberships, luxury cars, and a fake tech empire for their golden son-in-law. I announced that they had attempted to force me into a psychiatric conservatorship just 24 hours ago to cover their tracks, but they had unknowingly signed a legally binding confession instead. Chloe rushed forward, pressing her hands against the edge of the stage. Her face was contorted in a mixture of rage and terror. She screamed that I was ruining her life, waving her left hand in the air, the massive emerald-cut diamond catching the harsh glare of the camera flashes. I looked down at my sister and told her that her ring, her haute couture gown, and her entire affluent existence were funded by wire fraud. I suggested she take a long, hard look at that diamond, because it was likely the only asset the federal government would allow her to keep to pay for her husband's criminal defense attorney. The CEO of Apex Health Systems stepped forward, his face a mask of furious corporate authority. He did not address Trevor. He looked directly at me, acknowledging my position and the undeniable weight of the federal injunction I was holding. He turned to his legal team standing near the stairs and ordered them to immediately withdraw the acquisition offer and secure all preliminary funds. He turned his back on Trevor completely effectively, severing Vanguard Innovations from the medical industry in a single devastating motion. Trevor let out a guttural sound of pure panic. He lunged across the desk, reaching for the buyout contract as if simply holding the paper could somehow save his collapsing empire. But there was nothing left to save. The illusion was dead. I stood firmly in the center of the stage, the heavy gold crest on my blazer shining brilliantly in the spotlight, watching the men and women who had tortured me for years realize that they were absolutely powerless. The checkmate was complete, and the board had been flipped entirely in my favor. The utter destruction of his reality finally snapped whatever fragile restraint Trevor had left. The polished, charismatic CEO facade violently shattered, leaving behind nothing but the raw, desperate rage of a cornered thief. He let out a visceral, echoing scream that tore through the silent pavilion. He lunged across the antique mahogany desk, his hands outstretched, aiming directly for my throat. He wanted to physically tear the truth away from me, but I did not take a single step back. I did not blink. I stood planted on the stage watching him charge because I knew he would never reach me. Before his fingers could even graze the dark wool of my blazer, 3 massive men in tactical suits swarmed the platform. They were not my parents' private event security. They were undercover federal agents Mr. Vance had strategically positioned in the front row. They tackled Trevor with brutal, uncompromising efficiency, slamming his body hard against the polished wooden floorboards of the stage. The heavy thud of the impact reverberated through the microphones. Trevor writhed against the floor, his bespoke suit tearing at the shoulders, screaming wildly that I was a liar and a thief. He thrashed against the agents, holding him down, looking exactly like the deranged, unhinged criminal he truly was. Chloe shrieked in absolute horror, scrambling up the steps of the stage to try and pull the agents off her husband. A 4th agent simply raised a hand, blocking her path and ordering her to step back or face immediate arrest for interfering with a federal operation. Chloe froze, her scarlet haute couture gown trembling as she stared down at Trevor pinned to the floor in handcuffs. The golden child was entirely paralyzed, watching the foundation of her entire affluent life be aggressively dismantled in real time. I stepped over Trevor's thrashing legs and walked directly to the podium. I was not finished. Stopping the $50 million buyout was only the financial execution. I needed to ensure their social and moral destruction was just as absolute. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black remote. I aimed it at the audio-visual booth located at the back of the pavilion where one of Mr. Vance's legal associates was currently manning the controls. I pressed the button. The massive LED screen behind me, which had been displaying the sleek, spinning 3D model of my grandfather's stolen valve, instantly went black. A split second later, a high-resolution, glaringly bright document flashed across the massive display. It was the forged deed of assignment. I spoke into the microphone, my voice slicing through the chaos on the stage. I directed the attention of the state senators, the venture capitalists, and the elite society members to the screen. I clicked the remote again. A side-by-side forensic analysis provided by FBI handwriting experts appeared. It highlighted the exact discrepancies in my grandfather's signature, pointing out the shaky, hesitant strokes of a forgery compared to his authentic medical charts. I clicked again, and the screen transitioned to a dizzying, complex web of financial wire transfers. I narrated the slides with cold, clinical precision. I showed the crowd the exact dates my parents had authorized illegal withdrawals from the Jefferson Medical Trust. I pointed to the offshore shell companies and the direct routing numbers that funneled millions of dollars into Vanguard Innovations' operating accounts. I showed them the receipts for Chloe's luxury cars, Vivian's designer wardrobe, and Marcus's country club dues, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that their entire empire was built on embezzled funds. The affluent crowd was visibly repulsed. The elite African-American business leaders, people who had spent their lives building genuine, respectable legacies, stared at my parents with absolute disgust. Marcus tried to shout over my presentation, claiming the documents were fabricated, but his voice lacked any authority. He was sweating profusely, his face pale and terrified. Vivian was physically shrinking into the crowd, trying to hide behind the very people she had been boasting to just 10 minutes earlier. But the crowd actively stepped away from her, leaving my parents isolated in a growing circle of condemnation. I looked down at Vivian and Marcus. I told them that financial fraud was merely a symptom of their rot. I told the audience that the true depth of their depravity went far beyond stolen money. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen went dark, but the state-of-the-art surround sound system crackled to life. The crisp, undeniable audio of the recording I had taken in my father's study echoed through the silk pavilion. The voices of Vivian and Marcus flooded the night air loud and crystal clear. The entire crowd heard Vivian's harsh, grating voice, threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward. They heard her proudly outline how she would use my past mental health struggles to permanently silence me. They heard Marcus detailing his plan to use corrupt doctors on his payroll to sign a fake involuntary commitment order. They heard the terrifying calculated extortion as my parents threatened to strip away my basic human rights simply to protect their stolen money. The audio played my manufactured desperate sobs. The crowd listened as I begged my parents for mercy, followed by Vivian coldly ordering me to pick up the pen and sign away my life. When the audio recording clicked off, the silence in the pavilion was absolute and deafening. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of their own words hung over the manicured lawns. There was no spinning this. There was no public relations firm in the world that could erase the sound of a mother threatening to medically kidnap her own daughter for profit. The CEO of Apex Health Systems, the man who was supposed to write the $50 million check, turned to his legal counsel. He loudly and unequivocally instructed them to sever all ties with Vanguard Innovations and to permanently blacklist Marcus, Vivian, and Trevor from any future industry dealings. The private equity investors who had funded Trevor's early rounds began frantically dialing their lawyers, realizing they were now entangled in a massive federal racketeering case. Then the flashing red and blue lights pierced the sheer silk walls of the tent. The wail of multiple sirens cut through the humid Atlanta night, growing louder and more intense until a fleet of dark SUVs swerved onto the manicured grass of the estate. The doors flew open, and dozens of men and women wearing dark windbreakers, with FBI and SEC emblazoned across their backs, swarmed the terrace. It was a perfectly coordinated, overwhelming raid. The federal agents marched straight through the parted crowd, Two agents ascended the stage and hauled Trevor to his feet, reading him his Miranda rights for securities fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. He was sobbing now, the arrogant tech CEO completely broken, begging Chloe to call a lawyer as they dragged him off the platform. Down on the grass, a separate squad of agents surrounded my parents. Marcus raised his hands in surrender, his face buried in his chest, utterly defeated. An agent secured the handcuffs around his wrists, informing him he was under arrest for trust fraud, extortion, and tax evasion. Vivian fought against the agent, screaming hysterically that she was a respected philanthropist, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that her expensive velvet gown was being ruined. The agents ignored her protests, locking the steel cuffs around her wrists and leading her away in front of her horrified social circle. Chloe was left standing entirely alone at the edge of the stage. The federal agents did not arrest her, but they did not need to. Her punishment was the complete and total erasure of her reality. She was a woman who possessed absolutely no skills, no ambition, and no identity beyond the wealth she had married into and the stolen money she had spent. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking so badly the massive diamond ring caught the flashing lights of the police cruisers. I looked down at her, my face a mask of absolute indifference. I did not offer her a single ounce of pity. The cameras of the local press corps flashed relentlessly, capturing the spectacular, devastating fall of the Vanguard Empire. They photographed Trevor being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. They captured Vivian and Marcus being driven away in disgrace. And they captured me, standing tall on the mahogany stage in my grandfather's restored blazer, watching the wreckage burn. The false kings and queens had been permanently dethroned, and the true heir was finally in control. The fallout was immediate, brutal, and absolutely merciless. Trevor's $50 million dream vanished the exact moment the steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He was denied bail, deemed a severe flight risk, given the magnitude of the international wire fraud and his sudden, desperate attempts to transfer funds to offshore accounts while sitting in holding. His trial was a spectacle covered relentlessly by national financial networks and local Atlanta news stations. The evidence I had provided, the forged deed of assignment, the stolen blueprints, and the complete financial trail of his fake startup, was airtight. Trevor was convicted of securities fraud, grand larceny, and corporate espionage. The judge, clearly disgusted by the sheer audacity of his scheme, sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. The golden son-in-law was reduced to an inmate number, his bespoke suits permanently replaced by a cheap jumpsuit. My parents fared no better. The FBI raid on the estate uncovered decades of systematic tax evasion and financial manipulation. Marcus and Vivian had not only stolen my inheritance, they had been aggressively underreporting their assets and hiding their embezzled funds in dummy corporations. The federal government seized absolutely everything. The sprawling Buckhead estate, the luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, and the offshore accounts were all liquidated to satisfy IRS penalties and victim restitution. Marcus was indicted for trust fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit medical kidnapping. The audio recording of his threat to lock me in a psychiatric ward sealed his fate. He pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out, humiliating trial, hoping for leniency, but the judge showed no mercy, handing down a 10-year sentence. The man who had spent his life projecting an image of untouchable elite authority was stripped of his dignity and his freedom. Vivian's collapse was even more spectacular. She fought the charges tooth and nail, spending the last of her legally acquired funds on high-priced defense attorneys, who ultimately abandoned her when the sheer volume of evidence became insurmountable. She was convicted of being a co-conspirator in the trust fraud and extortion. Her sentence was slightly lighter than Marcus's, but the true punishment was her absolute social annihilation. The elite African-American society of Atlanta, the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, completely ostracized her. The very friends she had boasted to at the gala refused to take her calls, deleting her from their contacts and pretending they had never known her. Vivian stripped of her wealth, and her status was forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated apartment on the outskirts of the city. her life entirely defined by the ruin she had brought upon herself. And then there was Chloe, the golden child who had spent her entire life basking in the glow of my misery, was completely abandoned. Trevor's assets were frozen and seized, leaving her with absolutely nothing. The massive emerald-cut diamond ring, the haute couture gowns, the luxury cars, all of it was repossessed by federal authorities. She had no education, no skills, and no work experience beyond being a wealthy trophy wife. The social circle she had cultivated immediately discarded her. Her friends blocked her on social media and ignored her desperate pleas for help. Chloe was forced to face the reality of the world without the protective shield of stolen money. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she eventually found work as a waitress at a mid-tier restaurant in the suburbs. The irony was not lost on me. The woman who had loudly mocked my cheap clothing and ordered me to clean floors was now spending her days serving tables, relying on tips to survive, entirely dependent on the kindness of the very people she used to look down upon. Her glamorous, entitled existence had evaporated, leaving behind a harsh, unforgiving reality. It took exactly 3 months for the federal courts to fully untangle the massive financial web my parents had woven. Jonathan Vance navigated the bureaucratic nightmare with his usual lethal precision. The $12 million, along with every single cent of the accumulated interest, and the absolute exclusive rights to the Jefferson Valve, were legally and permanently restored to my name. I did not just take the money and walk away. I took the entire corporate infrastructure of Vanguard Innovations, completely stripped it of its fraudulent branding, and immediately dissolved the board of directors. I rebranded the entity as Jefferson Medical Technologies, honoring the man who actually did the work. As for the $50 million buyout from Apex Health Systems, the executives came crawling back to the negotiating table the moment they realized they were dealing with the legitimate owner of the intellectual property. I did not sell the company to them. I retained total ownership. Instead, I negotiated a highly lucrative licensing agreement, ensuring that my grandfather's invention would be manufactured and distributed to save lives globally, while generating a perpetual stream of generational wealth that my biological family could never touch. But securing the bag was only half the victory. The true triumph was restoring honor to a name that had been dragged through the mud by greedy cowards. I took a significant portion of the initial licensing revenue and established the Dr. Isaiah Jefferson Memorial Scholarship Fund. It was not just a generic charity designed for tax write-offs. It was a fully funded, comprehensive pipeline designed exclusively for brilliant, underprivileged African American medical students. It paid for their tuition, their housing, and their board exam preparations. It was specifically built to eliminate the exact financial barriers and psychological warfare my parents had tried to use to crush my own medical dreams. On the day the first 20 scholarships were awarded, Dean Sterling stood beside me in the soaring glass atrium of the Atlanta Medical Institute. He looked at the heavy bronze plaque bearing my grandfather's name, which was now permanently mounted in the main surgical wing, and told me that Dr. Jefferson's true legacy was finally in safe hands. I had taken the name my family tried to bury in shame and carved it directly into the marble walls of history. I also officially accepted my seat in the medical program. I was no longer begging for a spot. I was stepping into my destiny on my own terms, fully funded by the empire I had reclaimed. The dust has completely settled now. I am sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the center of my Atlanta penthouse. The evening sun is pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm golden glow across the room. I lift a delicate porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea to my lips and take a slow, quiet sip. The chaos, the screaming, the years of psychological manipulation, it is all gone. The silence in this apartment is not lonely. It is the sound of absolute, untouchable peace. If there was a camera tracking this exact moment, it would slowly begin to pull back. It would glide smoothly across the polished hardwood floors, drifting further and further away, framing me against the sprawling, illuminated skyline of the city I now own. I looked directly into the lens, completely unbothered and utterly victorious. My mother, my father, and my sister thought they could destroy me. They thought pouring a bottle of toxic chemicals over my only professional blazer would burn away my confidence and force me to submit to their control. They wanted to stain me with their jealousy, so I would match the ugly, broken picture they had painted of me. They wanted me to feel like a worthless college dropout begging for scraps at their table. But they fundamentally misunderstood how the chemistry of truth actually works. Bleach does not destroy reality. It is a harsh, violent sanitizer. It stripped away the dark navy wool. It burned right through the fabric of their 24-year lie. It cleaned away all the dirt, the manipulation, and the fake family loyalty they tried to force, feed me only to reveal the pure, solid gold crest resting exactly where it was always meant to be. People will tell you that family is everything, that blood is an unbreakable bond. You have to honor no matter what kind of abuse they hurl your way. That is the biggest, most dangerous lie ever sold. Blood is just biology. True loyalty is earned, and respect is completely non-negotiable. When you find parasites feeding off your potential, wearing your face to mask their own greed, you do not try to fix them. You do not try to understand them or compromise your peace to keep them comfortable. You cut them out. You let them starve. And you build an empire right on top of their ashes.